We are week 4, and therefore, unsurprisingly, chapter 4 of the Old Testament book of Nehemiah. Andy gave a little bit of introduction to start with. I want to start this morning by introducing you, my guess is most of you won't know Frank Laubach. Frank Laubach was an American in the early part of the last century, a very well-educated man who hit probably the low point of his life, having lost 3 children to malaria, his professional career having taken a real nosedive, and in bad physical health himself. At that point, it's not unusual, I guess, for people to ask big questions. He did, and he really was asking, what is the meaning of his life? And he had this overwhelming sense that he should devote the rest of his life to 2 things. The adventure, an exploration of the adventure of devotional prayer, and for what he called the silent 1 billion. That was, in the 1930s, the 1 billion men and women around the world who were illiterate, and therefore kept in poverty and all sorts of other things as a result. His story is an extraordinary one, and I don't have time to tell it all now, but suffice to say that before he was done, he had created a literacy movement that literally went around the world. He found himself standing in front of kings and presidents and world leaders. 100 nations, more than 200 languages and dialects were the areas and the languages that he worked with. But he would say that that was not his greatest contribution to humanity. His greatest contribution was actually his writings and the lessons that he learned in terms of personal prayer. What energized him, what, if you like, made all the difference for Frank Laubach was a sense of calling. And we're going to look a bit more, as Andy's really started this off, at that sense of calling, that question of calling this morning. The root of the word, calling, literally means inner voice. Martin Luther, the great reformer, would describe calling as an inner longing or a pull to something from God. It's something that many men and women, famous and unknown, have experienced down the centuries. William Wilberforce famously knew a strong sense of vocation, and it propelled him to give the rest of his life to working for the abolition of slavery. Mother Teresa, though she didn't often speak about it, knew this very personal sense of call that inspired a whole generation of young women to literally sacrifice their futures for the needs of some of the world's poorest. Martin Luther King, he incited a whole generation to stand up on behalf of civil rights. Winston Churchill famously wrote at the beginning of the Battle of Britain that it felt like he was born for this moment. And his sense of vocation created or enabled many to live lives of sacrifice, acts of heroism in the face of huge national danger. Now, what I want to draw out to start with, though, is not just that individuals sometimes have a sense of vocation, but that becomes contagious. To be honest, when we look at the scriptures, the story is not so much about individuals who had a sense of calling, but communities that had a sense of calling. Churchill had a sense of call, but it drove many others to use the same sort of language. Same would be the case for Mother Teresa, any of the others I have mentioned. And that sense of calling, whether you're Churchill or one of the millions who were not named, but lived with a sense of we give ourselves to this thing. This thing, vocation, is heady stuff. Your life, when you have it, feels like it's counting at a whole different level. And that somehow your small contribution, somehow your insignificant life is worth living, and the things that you're doing are worth doing as a result. And this is exactly what we see in the story of Nehemiah. Nehemiah, 5th century BC, has been overwhelmed with the sense of call to return to his capital and rebuild the walls. But of course, he gets there only to find he can't do this himself. Most calls worth doing are too big for one individual to carry off. So chapter 3, which we looked at last week, is when he gathers all sorts of people, perfume makers, goldsmiths, politicians, all sorts, and he gathers them together, and his call to them is, let us rebuild. And we think that that sense of calling and the galvanizing of a people is very applicable to the beginning of the 21st century. Over the last few weeks, we've spoken about some of the challenges that the church and people of faith face. We've talked about, in many areas, falling attendance, particularly amongst the young. We've talked about social change now occurring at warp speed, leaving some disillusioned and disorientated as a result. You can listen to the podcast if you're interested. We've likened the state of the church today to the state of Jerusalem 500 years before Christ, with a sense that the walls are down. And we've also spoken, though, of a broader sense of conviction that it's time in this nation for a renaissance, a revitalization of the Christian faith. Now, if this is to be the case, we should expect that not just the odd Nehemiah figure, but many of us know a sense of call to be worked out, whether it's in opera or whatever your world is. Part of my own sense of call was starting this church, something I lived with for 20 years before it happened. For you, it may be starting a church somewhere, sometime. It may be starting a Christchurch London site, same church, but in a different part of London. It may be to excel in the gifts that God has given you in your world, wherever that is. And seeking, therefore, to make the world a better place with a touch of what God does. He renews and restores, as well as helping many people, we trust, find faith. We're praying for newspaper editors and street sweepers who understand that God can use them where they're at with the gifts that they have and the resources that they have at their availability. Essentially, what we're seeking to do is what Paul spoke of with King David when he said that King David served God's purpose in his generation. Now, anyone, of course, who starts with a sense of calling, at that point, it's heady stuff. It's exciting, it's motivating, it's inspirational, but then you go from calling to conflict. A promise. In fact, when Paul wrote to Timothy, he said, anyone who wants to live a godly life can expect trouble or persecution. So there you go. There's a promise for you this morning. Nehemiah hit conflict, and that's the story of this morning. So the question that we'll consider is, how do we live with a sense of calling, whether it's a corporate sense of calling, a corporate sense we think we can do something with the rest of the church, of course, to make a contribution to the revitalization of the Christian faith and the flourishing of society, whether it's our corporate sense or our individual sense. We're going to look at what happens when you get going and the conflict that arises. We're going to read the whole of Nehemiah chapter 4. If you struggle with long Bible readings, I apologize, but I promise you, I tried to cut this chapter every way I could. But it tells a story. And so I'd ask if you would follow along as the story unravels, and it will help you benefit from the rest of this morning all the more if you can do that. So here we go. Nehemiah 4 verse 1. When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding, Sanballat's a leader in Jerusalem, rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. It's not always bad when somebody's angry at you. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said, "What are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore the wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from these heaps of rubble, burned as they are? Tobiah the Ammonite, will find Sanballat's friend, jumps in. And he says, what are they building? Even a fox climbed on it. He would break down their wall of stones. Nehemiah just turns and prays. Hear us, he says, O our God, for we're despised. Turn our insults back on their heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Don't cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they've thrown insults in the face of the builders. So, goes on Nehemiah, we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, for the people worked with all their heart. But when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs and the Ammonites and the men of Ashdod heard the repairs to Jerusalem's wall had gone ahead and the gaps were being closed, they were now not only angry but very angry. They all plotted to come together and fight. Words had not done the trick. They thought, now we will use violence, fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. But we prayed to our God and posted a guard day and night to meet his threat. Meanwhile, the people of Judah said, the strength of the laborers is giving out. There's so much rubble, we cannot rebuild the wall. They're like commentators. You've got Sanballat and Tobiah opposing Nehemiah. You've got Nehemiah working, and then those looking on. They say, hopeless situation. Verse 11, also our enemies said, before they know it or see us, we'll be right there amongst them. We'll kill them and put an end to their work. Then the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times over. It's easy to resist things once. When you've heard it 10 times, it can be rather more difficult. Wherever you turn, they will attack us. Therefore, I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families with swords, spears, and bows. And after I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, officials, and rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember, the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. And when our enemies heard that we were aware of their plot and that God had frustrated it, we all returned to the wall, each to his own work. From that day on, half of my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers posted themselves behind all the people of Judah. When you face opposition in your life, it sometimes slows you down. It did here, because half the guys had to stop working in order to guard, who were building the wall. Those who carried materials did their work with one hand and held a weapon with the other. Tricky. And each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked. But the man who sounded the trumpet stayed with me. Then I said to the nobles, officials, and the rest of the people, the work is extensive and spread out. We're widely separated from each other along the wall. Wherever you hear the sound of the trumpet, join us, and our God will fight for us. So we continued to work with half the men holding spears from the first light of dawn till the stars came out. And at that time I said to the people, have every man and his helper stay inside Jerusalem at night, so they can serve us as guards by night and workmen by day. Sometimes when you're living out vacation, you don't get to sleep very much, apparently, according to that verse. Neither I nor my brothers nor my men nor the guards with me took off our clothes. Each had his weapon, even when he went to water. I want to draw out of this passage a number of lessons that we can learn from Nehemiah. Let's see how many we get to on the question of our calling and his. The first thing I see from this is that Nehemiah developed an unwavering conviction that he could get the job done. He knew he could do it. Now it's interesting, first opposition, Sanballat and Tobiah, they go for his mind. Whenever we're living with a sense of calling, the first battle is always a battle in the mind. Sanballat says, what are you feeble Jews doing? In verse 2, and Tobiah, as we read, adds in, what are they building? Even a fox climbed on it, he would break down the walls of stone. They're essentially saying this. They're saying that you are not up to this and your work is not good enough. You are not up to this, you're not enough, and your work is not good enough. Why is it that these words are so powerful? Why is it that this challenge becomes an obstacle for so many of us? I want to suggest it's because deep down, every one of us fears that this is actually true. Every one of us actually fears that we are not enough. and that we haven't got the skills and we haven't got the ability to live out the sort of life that we believe we're being asked to do so. So how do we respond? How do you respond when you have a sense of calling or conviction, but you're struggling to come to terms with the fact, am I really enough for it? Let me just suggest two things. The firstly, simply to recognize that there is some truth in the fact that you are not enough. We are fallen beings with a huge history of messing things up. Our work is often feeble and it is often poor. That's part of the challenge. But we're not just fallen beings, we're also made in God's image. And salvation, getting to know God, is, amongst other things, about God starting to bring His image in you and me to the fore. So that with His help and with His power, we find that we are able to do things that we were not able to do before. If we had time, we'd look through the New Testament and the sort of descriptions. Paul says that the power that raised Jesus from the dead is now in your and my life. So whilst we are fallen, we also are carriers, if you like, of glory and of the image of God. Now, as we draw closer to God, it's not unusual for us to experience some sense of vocation, an inner prompting to make a contribution in a particular area, as personal as the family, as public as the stage. It can be anywhere. An awareness, as we draw closer to God sometimes, that our lives have a greater purpose than simply to exist. A sense that we're caught up in something much bigger than ourselves, and that someone much greater than I has determined that we will be used to accomplish certain things, whatever the odds. That is what Nehemiah was living with. We're not told quite where it came. It probably started in chapter 1 when he is grieving. When you feel emotion and passion about something, it puts something often deep within you. But then it was probably strengthened as he travels back to Jerusalem, and as he's traveling, he will have been reflecting and thinking back on the history of the Jews. He may have thought this. Thought, how about that arrogant teenager? The one imprisoned for sex crimes that he didn't commit. The one who in the end came to be second in the whole nation of Egypt and fed the known world at the time. How about Joseph? If God could use someone like that. Or maybe he thought, how about that guy who felt entirely inadequate speaking in public? In fact, he refused to go and speak to the most powerful man of the time, Pharaoh. Had to get his brother Aaron to come and do it. But if God can use someone who can't even get words out of his mouth, maybe he could use me. Maybe he thought again. Well, if God could use that ragtag bunch of slaves who'd lost many of their sons to destroy the elite army of the time as they went through the Red Sea in obedience to God and the waters crashed down on the Egyptian army, maybe he can use me. He may have thought about Joshua and the falling of the walls of Jericho. It feels like almost in every chapter of every book, there are illustrations of those who were feeble on their own who God used. Nehemiah must have reasoned, if he's done this with them, maybe he can do the same with us. Now, I want to suggest nothing's changed. We cannot, of course, create a sense of calling. None of us can make that happen. And that is not your job. But when you have it, you should look after it and not allow the challenges that come to undermine your sense of confidence. It would have been these sorts of thoughts that sustained Nehemiah as Tobiah and then Sanballat had their go at him. He developed this sense of conviction. And sometimes, as I said, it's very personal. Other times, as we looked at last week, you're just saying, I'm called to be with him and I'll serve, doing whatever. But there was this sense of conviction. I know this is meant to be. Secondly, once Nehemiah had this, we see that he took action. His response each time there was conflict was to do something. Verse 6. So we rebuilt the wall, and the people worked with all their heart. They'd not been discouraged, they gave everything. Verse 9. And we posted a guard day and night to meet the threat. Verse 14. He says, remember the Lord and fight for your wives and your homes. The truth is that most people's sense of calling does not materialize into anything more concrete because they fail to do the right things in the right way for long enough. They fail to do the right things in the right way for long enough. I think that people of faith, Christians, are possibly more guilty of this than most. And I'll tell you why. Because we live with the hope that suddenly everything will change. That once we've prayed, that suddenly God will sweep in. And pretty much every book in the Christian bookshop, or what used to be the Christian bookshops, but loads and loads of Christian books give that impression. I want to tell you, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. If I had time this morning, I could tell you many wonderful stories, but what doesn't get told is the backstory. The backstory is often the years of back-breaking work that precedes the moment. That precedes the, wow, that's amazing. The privilege, having graduated from university, to going to work with a lady called Jackie Pullinger. Stories are told about Jackie all around the world, wonderful stories. She, as a 19-year-old, lived in the slums in Hong Kong. In the end, was responsible for triad leaders coming to faith. Many people coming off heroin. The slums are now razed, but there's still a plaque in the garden that's there. Speaking of Jackie Pullinger, the OBE, the Queen, awarded her and her work. Now, she truly is an extraordinary person with an extraordinary story. But people forget to tell about the 5 years where she saw nothing happen. People forget to tell the story of the fact that in those 5 years her father died and she didn't have the money for an airfare to get back to the UK for the funeral. People forget to tell the story that after 15 years, she essentially lost the whole ministry that she'd had. It all dissipated, and she had to give herself to another painstakingly grinding decade of back-breaking building of the walls before she got something not only the same, but actually significantly better. Nehemiah understood this. And when conflict came, he just said, keep doing what you're doing. Keep building the walls. It's easy, particularly in 21st century life, where we have so many different options, to build a wall for a little one and say, well, it's more boring. It's not as interesting as I thought it was. I think that part of the wall over there is rather more interesting. Or, my back's hurting. I didn't think following a call would be painful. It's not as fulfilling as I thought, whatever. Thomas Edison, the great inventor, he said this: true genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. Nehemiah calls us here, if we're to rebuild the walls, to perspiration much of the time. It's as we give ourselves, brick after brick after brick after brick, steady, wise, purposeful, that there are moments where suddenly it feels like everything lurches ahead and people tell the stories. But we mustn't forget the backstory. And we give ourselves to that individually and corporately together. But he didn't just act, he also prayed. He prayed. Verse 4, hear us, O God. He doesn't even answer their Sanballat and Tobiah's words. He just ignores them. He just turns immediately to God in prayer. Verse 9, we prayed to our God. Verse 14, he says to everyone, remember the Lord, who's great and awesome. While Nehemiah's working hard, he does not expect hard work to make him successful. He is over his head here. He knows he needs God's help. Now, sometimes I think people get a bit confused on this. They say, what am I meant to do? Am I meant to pray and trust God, or am I meant to work? I want to suggest that what the scriptures teach is that we do both. It's 100% God, and it's 100% you. We trust him, we pray, and then we go to work. This is what Nehemiah did here. Now, if you don't want to lose your physical strength, you need to eat every day. If you don't want to become sick, you need to exercise every day. Now, I want to suggest that if you want to be spiritually strong, you also need to pray regularly as well. We cannot pursue a vocation just by skill or hard work. Prayer is essential. I don't know exactly what that means for you. All of us are living different lives in different worlds. We have to work it out. One friend of mine works in the city, young family, with little babies, getting them up very early in the morning at the moment. We've been talking about this. What does it mean for him? And he said, you know what it means for me right now? 3 days a week. 3 days a week, we've worked out my schedule so I can have a good amount of time where I pray. Now, if you're single, you can do it every day. But there are different seasons of your life or different responsibilities that make that harder. But my encouragement to you, work even when it's backbreaking, and pray. This is what Nehemiah did. Next, we see that Nehemiah and his friends simplified their life around their calling. You cannot say yes to a sense of vocation without saying no to other things. Now, this is something Londoners are bad at. We're very good at saying yes, and thinking that miraculously we can add yet another thing to our overpacked lives. You cannot add a sense of vocation to an already busy life and hope to do it on Wednesday evenings between 9 and 10. It's particularly the case in this city, where, as we've said before, so many of us end up living fragmented lives. We work in one place, live somewhere else, want to make a contribution or be on mission in another area. Consequently, most Londoners constantly feel torn, always feel stressed, and go around feeling much less productive than they could. I want to suggest that we have to understand what the most important thing in our lives is and then center our lives around it. This is what Nehemiah did. He understood his people could build and fight, but they needed community. So what did he do? He said, gather on the walls in families, so that you don't have to run over the other side to go and catch up with your friends. Do it together. Find those who are doing this part of the wall and become a community there. Then later, once things had really heated up and they could be attacked at any moment, Nehemiah said, okay, it's now not just relationships. You've not got to just get close to the people who you're going to have community with. He said, some of you need to move so that you can do your mission somewhere where you've not got to commute. These people were outside Jerusalem. He says, I want you all to sleep inside Jerusalem. And what we see here is the mission develops as the sense of vocation grows. So people are saying, how can I work my life together? Probably the most famous example of this simplification is the Clapham Sect. A group of Christian men and women from different walks of life with William Wilberforce at their centre. Writers, politicians, academics, a brewer. Did you know that? A banker who cared about social reform and particularly the slave trade. And Holy Trinity Clapham, church still there in Clapham, was the centre of their activities. Now these men and women lived close enough to one another to have genuine community. Most in Clapham, few in Battersea. They were close enough to the city and Parliament to go about their day jobs, and they were also in the right place for their mission. Close enough to central London to bring pressure on the elites of the day to end slavery. We think this is a very viable model for many in the church to gather to build different parts of the wall. If I had time, I would give examples. Of course, it was a year ago that Joel Kendall and some others of you moved east and created a community there, lived close to one another, started caring for your area, did Imago Dei markets, did all sorts of other things to gather people together, to add value to the community, as well as helping people find faith at the same time. We heard from this stage last week that Rich Hillier is starting a group in the city. Now, he's not suggesting everybody moves to the city. He understands that many who work in the city inhabit their jobs. And therefore it makes sense to build family right there where that is happening rather than anywhere else. I don't know how this would work for you, but I want to put the question in your mind. Where is your particular sense of vocation? Or maybe you're just saying, I'm here to serve right now. Where is it that you are meant to serve? Is your life ordered in such a way that you're able to benefit from a community? Is your life ordered in such a way that it makes it possible to live out your mission in the sort of way that you want to? Maybe the band could come back, please. The final thing I want to draw your attention to is that Nehemiah determined to do whatever was necessary. He didn't seem threatened by the possibility of physical pain. He just said, when they threatened him, he just said, we posted a guard day and night. He was prepared to go without sleep. Verse 21, we continued the work from the first light of dawn till the stars came out, not just till it got dusk, till the stars were out, and then no doubt he had all sorts of other meetings to keep everything going till much later. And he was prepared to do so without comfort. In verse 23, neither I nor my brothers, nor my men, nor the guards with me took off our clothes, because that was what was required at the time. In other words, as you read this passage, you get the impression Nehemiah really was prepared to lay down his life in order to get the job done. Now, a woman or a man who's prepared to give anything is an inspiration to follow and a nightmare to oppose. Most people think that happiness comes from acquiring things, but actually Jesus taught that it comes from self-sacrifice. So this is actually a far wiser way to live than most of us think it is. It is by losing our lives that we find them. Now, Nehemiah would not have fully understood that what he was doing was imitating the life of Jesus. But from our vantage point, we can see that. We know that Jesus lived with that unwavering conviction, I'm here to gather, to teach, and to die, and to rise again. We know Jesus coupled action and prayer. We know Jesus simplified his life. The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head, but he lived with his community on a mission the whole time. And we know that Jesus was prepared to pay the ultimate cost. He gave his life. He did so in order that you and I might experience life. Life for life. He gave his that we might have it. There is no better life than one lived in relationship with him in pursuit of his best for the world. I want to exhort you and I want to call you to live that sort of life. Let me say it once more. There is no better life than the one lived in relationship with your Maker in pursuit of his very best for the world. And I want to invite you to take that path. If you are trying to work all this out at the moment, I would encourage you, if there's any way you can join us Monday night or Tuesday night for Alpha, join us. If you have friends who you think are asking those sort of questions too, do bring them along. But if you've already decided to follow him, I want to ask you, what is the next step for you? Developing unwavering conviction, action and prayer, simplicity of life, or losing your life that you would gain it? Let's stand together, shall we?